Thank you so much. Since I do not see who all are attending, hello to everyone. I understand this is a meeting for the journalists in Africa, and this is focuses on water. So this is, I think, enormous need, as Barry was so clearly enunciating in his presentation about the need for Africa to do more on irrigation, more on water management, etc. So just let me know if I'm clearly audible. What I am going to do today, and maybe I don't want to take a lot of time, but open up for more discussions. But I am going to, on behalf of all my colleagues who were involved in writing the IPCC assessment for this working group 2, which was published in February 2022. I was one of the coordinating lead authors of the water chapter of the IPCC, and I'm going to present some of our highlights from that. And with some focus on Africa, not a lot, but I know that the author from the Africa chapter is also meeting all of you next in like day after tomorrow. So the five main conclusions, ours is quite a long chapter, and there is a two-page succinct summary there's a two-page succinct executive summary that's at the start of the chapter. And I would very much encourage you to read at least the executive summary, if not the whole chapter. The chapter is, of course, 150 pages long, but the chapter was used quite extensively by the Egyptian COP presidency this year to align some of their programs, including a water focus program that they launched at the COP called AWARE program, which they informed us was very much inspired by the IPCC water chapter of the working group 2. The way I want to summarize is that climate crisis is also water crisis, is water is neglected in climate change negotiation. And I'm going to make 5 points. First is, now we are not only seeing climate variability in water. One, I was listening to Barry, and Barry was talking to variability and not climate change, saying that the signature of climate change and hydrological cycle was not that clear. But that's not true any longer. We know that every component of the hydrological cycle has been impacted by climate change. And this is both the working group chapter that I led, but also, so if there are chat messages, should I be? Okay, yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just need to. So what we are finding is that every component of the water cycle has been impacted, and this is both the conclusion of the working group 1, the physical science of climate change. They had a chapter on water, and the working group 2, the chapter that I co-led, also had on vulnerability and adaptation. Both the chapters have concluded, based on the literature, that climate change has led to changes in all components of the water cycle, not both observed changes and, of course, projected changes for the future. So this has resulted in impacts, and mostly negative, in almost all sectors of the economy and the society. That's what the focus of our chapter was, how changes in the climate-led changes in the water cycle is affecting all the different sectors of the economy. Agriculture being one of the most highly vulnerable. The third conclusion that our chapter drew based on the assessed literature is majority of the people in the global south, especially in climate-exposed occupations such as agriculture. And again, Barry told us 60% of the population depends on agriculture in Africa. They are the ones most exposed, and they also experience climate change through water. What we also find that while water is a big part of the problem, because people are experiencing climate change through water, be it extreme precipitation, droughts, precipitation variability, melting of the glaciers, and all of those, solution is also found in water. We are finding that almost 60% of the adaptation are happening either in response to water-related hazards, and many of these adaptation are also using water. Example, irrigation. Irrigation is one of those really effective adaptation measures, which of course has its limits like everything, but irrigation, rainwater harvesting, soil moisture management, even some of the genetic innovations around crops and all are all coming through water. water. And then finally, which is not so discussed, and Africa also doesn't really have to do a lot of mitigation because we are not the guys who are emitting a lot, but many mitigation that are being now discussed today in terms of nature-based solutions such as afforestation, mitigation requiring reduction in the fossil fuel emission, also have a water footprint, which is not very well discussed. So I'll come to our main finding. This is a diagram for the Working Group 2 water chapter, where we are showing that every aspect of the water cycle has been affected. These include heavy precipitation, droughts, floods, melting of cryosphere like the glaciers, etc. Now, to give some examples, this is from the IPCC Working Group 1 summary for policymakers. What is of concern? So this is a stylized depiction of the world, and here we are showing observed changes in heavy precipitation since 1950. So everything that is in green, there has seen an increase in heavy precipitation, and the kind of the agreement varies based on the literature. But what is of great concern, I think, and this is what we should be, if as scientists and as whatever as journalists, I think what we should be pushing for in the next 1 decade is really that the evidence. So this is the Africa part of the diagram, that we are seeing a limited data, no literature. This is except for Western and Southern Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa. We are seeing these vast parts, Eastern Africa and all of those with really poor observational data, and this really needs to change, because we do know that lack of data does not mean that impacts are not being felt. We know from all kind of sources that people here are feeling the impacts, So basically, this is a call also for better observational data and more investments in these kind of water and hydromet data in the coming future. This, I think, is an absolute priority. Then we looked at the Working Group 1, also looked at the droughts. And again, similar, we are seeing a lot of increases in drought. And here there is data. Some places do not have data, low agreement, etc. But we are seeing majority of the regions within Africa are kind of, experiencing increase in observed drought. These are agricultural and ecological droughts since the 1950s. So basically, we know climate change is happening and causing droughts in much of Africa. Then we are also seeing glaciers are melting at unprecedented pace, perhaps not so relevant for Africa, not a lot of glaciers there, but the only one is also melting, as we know. And that's been covered also quite well in the other IPCC report of the SROC. Then what we are also seeing is what was quite unique about the AR6 is that we have seen a lot of observed impacts that have already happened historically from 1950s onwards. So climate change is no longer a thing that will happen in the future. Climate has changed. And I think that was our main message in AR6, that we are already living in a 1.1 degree warmer world, and that has affected every system, including the water system. Now, if we look at the projected climate and which way we will be going, whether we would be a 1.5 degree world or whether we would be a 2 degree world or a 4 degree world, absolutely depends on the actions that we now take in the next decade and a half. Our near-term actions will determine what we are by the end of this century. Whatever global warming levels we reach by the end of the century, irrespective of overshoot, etc., what reality remains is that annual mean precipitation changes are projected to intensify. So this part is likely to see much more intense rainfall, and that's going to be much more intense at a 4 degree world than a 1.5 degree world. So far 1.5 degrees still seems to be our best bet, given that we are already at 1.1 degree, but that requires steep emission cuts from the countries that are emitting a lot historically and now. And then for the continent of Africa, a lot of investments needs to be both in terms of improving the database, but also lots of investments in terms of adaptation. So we also look at that annual soil mean moisture change, which is very indicative of drought. And there also we are seeing all kind of intensification happening. And this is on the top of what Barry was, I think, talking, that we already have approximately a large number of people experiencing water scarcity for at least a month due to both the combination of climatic and non-climatic factors. So this climate change is actually exacerbating the already water scarce situation that we have. And, Africa is quite clear number of months in which water scarcity, and part of the scarcity is physical water scarcity, but a lot of the scarcity is also economic and institutional water scarcity. We may have water, but we may not have the access to that water because of economic and institutional reasons. So I mean, here water scarcity means not only the physical, but also the economic and institutional. So you can see that Africa actually is at the forefront of climate change. Then coming to the second point, all sectors of the economy and the society, especially in the global south, have been affected. So in our chapter, we kind of sifted through the literature and assessed the impacts on various sectors: agriculture, energy, water, sanitation, urban. And if you can see, negative here means negative impacts, and you can see almost for everything there was a negative impact. Almost all sectors have felt negative impacts, and these are of course much more vulnerable for the global south. For agriculture, we found that 3/4 of the global harvested land experienced drought during the period of 83 to 2009, with production losses of 9 to 10% due to weather extremes alone. Not all weather extremes will be due to climate change, but a lot of the extremes are due to climate change. So there is also that attribution part, but climate change is increasingly responsible for a lot of the weather extremes. In energy, we are finding that not only does Africa have much less hydropower investments, as Barry was saying, but we are also finding that globally during the drought years, the hydropower production declined by 5.5% compared to non-normal years. And this is particularly with the thermoelectric power, which also requires a lot of water for cooling. This was even worse. So if there's need to be more hydropower, there needs to be more energy production. Maybe it makes more sense to invest in renewable sources like solar instead of very high, dams and high investment hydropower, which again has its own limitations because of these extremes we are likely to face. We found, and there's a lot of evidence in our chapter, and extreme events like floods are linked with increased incidence of water-related diseases. In the urban, we looked at 17% of the cities we experience statistically significant increase in extreme precipitation. Some of it is climate change, but some of it is also the urban heat island effect of the cities themselves. On the fresh water, we assessed that between 70 to 2015, 35% of wetland area decline, where climate change is one of the important driver, not the only driver, but one of the most important drivers. So impacts of changing water cycle are being felt disproportionately by women, poor farmers, indigenous people. Here we do not have an example from Africa, unfortunately, because we were focusing mostly on the cryosphere related changes where there is a lot of dependence of indigenous people. But if we were to say select a farming system, a local farming system, Africa would have featured much more prominently. But the overall assertion that impacts of changing water cycle are being felt disproportionately by women, poor farmers, and indigenous farmers still holds. I will skip this. Okay, now I come to, I'm skipping this because this was very much an example from the Himalayas in Asia and not really relevant here in this context today. I come now to my fourth assertion that water is also part of the solution. We are finding that water is central to adaptation. 60% of all adaptation is occurring in response to water-related hazards. So that includes droughts, precipitation variability. So you can see the important adaptation measures that farmers are doing. These are improved cultivars, changes in cropping pattern, on-farm irrigation, water and soil moisture, collective action, policies, institution, migration. So all of these have bearing on water. I mean, farmers are doing, or people are doing these measures because they have because they're facing water related hazards. So we are seeing with what hazard they're responding. So for many of these measures are for droughts, many of them are for precipitation variability and extreme heat related extremes, etc. So water is central to adaptation is the goal here. Then we also found that majority of cases of water-related adaptation is happening in all regions and more so in Africa and Asia. This is where a lot of adaptation case studies, and these are published case studies, and this only scratches on the surface because so much adaptation happens without getting published in peer-reviewed documents, which we as scientists assess. A lot of adaptation is going on, and I think this is a good kind of thing for the journalist also to actually look at how are people adapting to climate change. And we can find that majority of that adaptation is happening in agriculture in both Africa and Asia, which is not surprising given agriculture consumes over 80% of the water. Agriculture is also most climate exposed. So all kinds of adaptation are happening in Africa, for instance, and these are the case studies from various countries. All the database is online. I'll be happy if you reach out to share all of those for any additional queries. So what we are finding is that there are many benefits to water-related adaptation. Those benefits include ecological benefits, economic benefits, institutional benefits, reduction in vulnerability, etc. These are some of the top in Africa. These are the top adaptations we are finding. We are finding a lot of improved cultivars and agronomic practices. This could include, sowing the crops early or later, depending on the changes in the rainfall cycle. We are finding, adoption of drought-resistant crop varieties or flood-resilient crop varieties. We are finding water management techniques that are changing. Then we are finding changes in cropping patterns. So farmers are changing the crops that they're growing. They're changing the crop systems. So that's kind of the green color here. Then we are finding that there is also a lot of efforts happening in migration and off-farm diversification. Farmers leaving agriculture, migrating, or a family member migrating, investing in off-farm. In the blue one is that we are finding some evidence of water and soil moisture conservation related initiative. The dark yellow one is on on-farm irrigation. So on-farm irrigation and water and soil moisture are quite important adaptation measures. And the orange one here is collective action policies, institutions, which in this case would include things like credit societies, different government subsidy schemes. Those are all helping farmers adapt. And the gray one is all kind of remaining categories, because here we are like looking at the top 6 categories, adaptation responses. So there's all kind of other things going on, but these are some of the top ways in which farmers are responding. In Asia, quite interestingly, water kind of plays. I mean, they're more or less close, but there's a bit of a change in the ordering of which adaptation is more prevalent where. And then we have, sorry, that's my daughter peeped in. So apologies for that. Then we also looked at how effective these different adaptation will remain at a higher level of global warming. First of all, we know there is effective, but they're not terribly effective in reducing climate risk. And on top of that, we know that we are going to reach a higher level of global warming, and many of these adaptation actually become less effective in the global warming. So this is a very complicated diagram. You just focus on the blue bits and the red bits, and you will see that the red bits keeps increasing at a higher degree, which means that these adaptation that we looked at becomes less and less effective at higher levels of global warming. This is the same diagram where we are comparing the current and the future. And, at a higher level of global warming for each of these, actually the residual risk, that is, they become less effective. And for some like on-farm irrigation, actually irrigation still remains effective till quite a high level of, like it becomes maladaptive or very less effective at 4 degrees. And before that, it's a bit inconclusive, but irrigation overall is thought to be quite effective. Okay, now the final part, where I think not as relevant for Africa, because Africa may not have to do as much mitigation because of very low carbon emissions from the continent as a whole. Africa as a whole contributed to not more than 5% of the global emissions so far. But while mitigation is going on, and it is entirely possible, the geopolitics is such that a lot of these mitigation schemes will be pushed in Africa. They are being done with all kinds of afforestation schemes and whatnot. Many of these mitigation measures and carbon dioxide removal approaches and technologies can have large trade-offs with water and food security. I will give two oft-quoted examples of that. One is bioenergy crop. When we replace food crops with crops for bioenergy, that can possibly alleviate global warming, but can potentially double the global area and population living under severe water stress. This is one paper. And then other papers are saying bioenergy crops can significantly impact food prices so basically, putting in land for growing bioenergy crop would have food implications, which Africa may not be able to afford, given that food security, food and nutrition security are a matter of concern. Similarly, for afforestation, reforestation, an important tool, nonetheless, if done in the wrong place at the wrong time, if we are doing afforestation in places that are already water scarce, then it may actually lead to changes in the water cycle. So to sum up, these are my main points. I'll just see 1 minute. Sorry. Sorry. This climate change is experienced first and foremost through changes in water regimes, extreme rainfall, floods, droughts, especially by a large majority in the global south, including in Africa, who depend on climate-exposed occupations like agriculture. Since the most vulnerable feel climate impacts through water also becomes a vehicle through which climate injustice propagates, because those who are feeling the impacts of climate change aren't necessarily the ones who have caused climate change. Water is part of the problem, but also part of the solution. Many of the adaptation measures involve use of water, irrigation, soil moisture conservation, rainwater harvesting to improve livelihoods, reduce vulnerability. Mitigation is the need of the hour, but if not well planned, some mitigation measures can make local water and food security worse through high water footprint. Water needs a seat at the mitigation table. So I'll stop here and pass it back to Julian and the team. And thank you so much for the opportunity. And my apologies again for getting the time wrong. Back to you. I am so sorry. I could only hear parts of the question. The audio was not so legible, but I did hear about some questions around local adaptation measures, and if there are any ways of using less water for rice. Yes, within the water management work, there is all these improved irrigation technologies, alternate wetting and drying, and things like that leads to lesser water application in rice. So those evidence exists. Those are, of course, mixed, because the moment you apply lesser water to rice, there may be yield impacts, or there could be issues around weeds, so that may increase labor costs. So none of these, the thing about adaptation, the thing about a lot of the solution is none of it is a silver bullet. Everything comes with pros and cons. Everything has to be very context specific. While our water problem is global, but our water solutions are very local, very context specific. So rice may be a completely appropriate crop in a certain locality in Africa and can be completely inappropriate in another. I mean, it's such a big continent with such a big context. So that was one question that I could hear. But if somebody with a bit clearer microphone can say some of the others, I'll be very happy to answer. The other alternative could be, if the questions can be typed on the chat here, then I can also see. But I really thought that the voice was, I couldn't hear so well. My apologies. I'm so sorry.
Hi, Aditi. This is Tobias Schmitz. I'm the editor of The Water Diplomat. I have a question about the data. Hello?
Yes, this is not very, very clear. Yes, this is very clear. Yes, thank you.
All right. I work for The Water Diplomat. I'm the editor or chief of The Water Diplomat. And at COP26, I noted that Hungary, the Netherlands, Tajikistan, and various other countries had an initiative on progressively integrating climate data with water data, for improved and integrated planning of the two sort of sectors of data gathering. Now, I think that your chapter and possibly chapters which will follow after this will be very, very useful for countries in integrating that data. But I have very little information so far on how the World Meteorological Organization and perhaps the SDG 6 data cluster collecting data on water will start to work together in the future to collect data, and maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, but thank you. I think that's an important one, and also something to look forward to the UN 23 conference that is happening in March in New York after 46 years. And I think these are the same countries which are pushing for these kind of integration. I don't know all the details about how the WMO actually operates, but I can actually ask some of my colleagues who work with the WMO and some of the co-authors of our chapter to find more details around it. But I do not have a lot of information. But I do know now that the water-related data kind of gets fed into the climate models. But I do not know whether the other way around, the SDG-related data is then also fed into those models. I am not, frankly, I don't know how that is exactly dealt with, but I'm happy to reach out to my other technical colleagues and find an answer.
Right.
I would often think that a challenge is on the scale, because a lot of our water and climate data is regional or global, while a lot of the SDG and water use data is much more local. So that integration scale is always a challenging one of incorporating global, regional versus local data.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Aditi. There's another question that was asked from another gentleman next to me here, so he's gonna come up to talk about it. But just before I forget, you've talked about a very important component. I think you talked about the WMO. Just maybe for the journalists in the house, we recently discovered that we as journalists don't make use of the meteorological departments that are very close to us in terms of reporting on issues of water and climate change. So I think that this is an opportunity for you also to interrogate the kind of information that they have. And I think that would be very useful in your writing. And then the other thing that also we need to think about, you know, when Caro has asked about issues of rice, we also need to look at the consumption of the various varieties that we have, not just rice, but, you know, the so-called indigenous or endemic species. And these are the species that we say are introduced and what have you. I don't want to get into the debate of GMOs and what have you, but we need also to interrogate in terms of the varieties of various crops that we have, in terms of water consumption and water availability. Just giving you some ideas that you can pursue. So over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you so. Thank you so.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Aditi, for the insightful presentation. My name is Kevin Zalo from Kenya. My question was actually building on your presentation on adaptation in Africa and by extension the rest of the world. And you are talking about the future of these adaptation strategies in the work of climate change. So now we're living in the 1.1 degree world, but then how sustainable are these adaptation measures? How sustainable will they be, for example, in a 2 degrees world? And you mentioned about nature-based solutions being some of the adaptation mechanisms being employed. And one of the things that you mentioned was the bioenergy crops. So I just wanted you to expound on that. And if you have any case studies of how this is working, because and where, because this seems to be something that could take Africa beyond the 1.1 degrees. Thank you.
Right. Oh, that's an actually very interesting question, and in my opinion, one of the most significant finding from our chapter was really that lot of the adaptation will not remain effective at a higher level of global warming. And that particularly affects Africa, it affects the poorer countries of Asia, because this is where already our adaptive capacities are low. So what does it really mean is that we should do everything that we can do as journalists, as scientists, as civil society organizers to make sure that we are not crossing 1.5 degree. We have to kind of say that, look, in some ways, therefore, I would say that mitigation is our best hope. Mitigation is the best adaptation. Not to say adaptation is not important, but just to say that we need adaptation investment, but let's be aware that we cannot adapt in a warmer world. So unless we take care of, reduce that warming levels, we are in a huge amount of problems. The same applies for nature-based solutions. A lot of the nature-based solutions will also become less effective when it warms. Like, the ability of the land and the ocean to absorb more carbon dioxide also depends on how much CO2 is already there. So in a warmer world where we already have a lot more CO2, then anything more cannot be so easily absorbed. So I think the main takeaway for me throughout this entire assessment cycle has been that countries with high emissions, countries with historical emissions, and countries who are high emitting pathway now have to really invest a lot more on mitigation. And keep within the Paris agreed goals of keeping it well below 2 degrees. Otherwise, a lot of our investment on adaptation will simply not work. So that's what I hope that the journalists will able to see. There's always this unnecessary tension between should we adapt in mitigation, should we adapt in adaptation. My take after doing this report has been that without proper mitigation, without keeping the temperatures within 1.5 degree, there will be no adaptation. There are limits to what you can adapt. I am from India, and this March, our temperatures in some of the wheat growing belts reach 50 degrees. Whatever you do, how much genetic innovations you do, there are no crops. Those are physiologically able, no wheat crop in the world that can physiologically tolerate temperatures of as high as 50 degrees during the key germination time. And those happened in March, right when the seeds start to germinate and, coming to the flowering stage. So there are limits to adaptation. And the sooner we understand the limits to adaptation, the sooner we understand that going beyond 1.5 to 2 degree is not an option, the sooner we come to solutions. So I think we need to bust this myth of endless adaptation. Adaptation is only a partial solution. The solution that we need to be striving for is changes in lifestyle for those who are emitting high carbon, and a decent standard of living for all through a low emission pathway. I hope I am able to answer your question that way, but I think it's a real limitation. We cannot adapt endlessly. It's just a technological fantasy to see that we would adapt at 4 degrees. Not possible. Sorry, is what I would say if as a scientist. Yes, over. Thank you.